Sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the cruelest laughter. When Jeremiah Stone, a 7-foot mountain man, walked hand in hand with Clara Magnuson through the dusty streets of Cedar Flats, the whole town erupted in mockery. They called them freaks and misfits, giants who didn't belong. But in the wilderness beyond town, their love created something powerful. Their sons grew into legends of strength and skill that frontier folk still whisper about today. What these laughing townspeople didn't know was that they were witnessing the birth of a dynasty that would change the West forever. But how does a family turn mockery into legend? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana Territory as Jeremiah Stone descended from his mountain cabin, carrying a freshly killed elk across his massive shoulders like other men might carry a sack of grain. At 7 feet tall and built like the granite peaks he called home, Jeremiah was a sight that made even seasoned frontiersmen pause in wonder. His beard, black as winter nights and streaked with early silver, framed a face weathered by 35 years of mountain living. For 2 decades, Jeremiah had lived alone in those high places where the air grew thin and the silence spoke louder than any human voice. He'd built his cabin with his own hands from lodgepole pine and chinked it with clay from the creek bed. His neighbors were elk and bear, mountain lions and golden eagles. The nearest settlement, Cedar Flats, lay 3 days' ride down treacherous switchback trails that claimed the lives of inexperienced travelers. Most folks in Cedar Flats knew Jeremiah only by reputation, the mountain hermit who appeared twice a year to trade furs and meat for supplies, speaking barely a dozen words to anyone before disappearing back into his wilderness domain. Children would peek from behind their mothers' skirts when his towering figure darkened the doorway of Mackenzie's general store. Women would cross themselves and whisper prayers. Men would nod respectfully but keep their distance, recognizing something wild and untamed in his pale blue eyes. The town itself squatted in a valley where Willow Creek meandered through stands of cottonwood and aspen. Cedar Flats had grown from a trading post into a proper settlement of nearly 300 souls, complete with a church, school, saloon, and the inevitable collection of businesses that sprouted wherever men gathered to wrestle civilization from the wilderness. Main Street stretched barely 4 blocks, flanked by false-fronted buildings that proclaimed their owners' optimism about the town's future. At the heart of Cedar Flats' social order stood Mayor Cornelius Weatherby, a portly man whose gold watch chain stretched across his considerable belly like a bridge spanning a canyon. Weatherby had arrived from St. Louis with grand plans and Eastern money, determined to bring culture and refinement to the frontier. His wife, Prudence, led the ladies' auxiliary with an iron fist wrapped in lace gloves, deciding who belonged in polite society and who remained forever on the outside. The Weatherby's circle included Judge Harrison Blackwell, whose stern countenance and black robes commanded respect in his makeshift courthouse, and Reverend Marcus Thornton, a thin man whose fire and brimstone sermons could make sinners sweat even in winter. These pillars of the community, along with the wealthier merchants and ranchers, formed an unofficial council that governed not just the town's laws, but its social fabric. Below them in the pecking order came the shopkeepers, craftsmen and smaller farmers, decent folk who worked hard, paid their debts, and kept their opinions to themselves. At the bottom rung stood the drifters, gamblers, and various characters whose past remained deliberately vague. Everyone had their place in Cedar Flats, and everyone knew where they stood. Into this carefully ordered world walked Clara Magnuson on a Tuesday morning in late September, driving a wagon loaded with her few possessions and pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses that seemed small beneath her commanding presence. Clara stood 6 feet and 4 inches in her bare feet, with shoulders broad enough to shame most men and hands that could shoe a horse or knead bread with equal skill. Her blonde hair, plaited in thick braids that fell past her waist, caught the morning light like spun gold. Her eyes, the color of summer sky, held intelligence, determination. And something else that made folks uncomfortable. A complete lack of apology for who she was. She'd traveled from Minnesota, carrying letters of recommendation from the Lutheran pastor who'd known her family since childhood. Clara Magnuson could read and write, keep books, tend the sick, and work iron at a forge better than most smiths. She'd come to Cedar Flats seeking opportunity and independence, two commodities as rare as hen's teeth for unmarried women on the frontier. The whispers started before Clara finished unhitching her horses. Women gathered in clusters, fans fluttering like nervous birds as they discussed the newcomer's unseemly height and unfeminine strength. Men stared openly, some with curiosity, others with the kind of interest that made decent women blush and reach for their shawls. "Good Lord in heaven," muttered Martha Caldwell, wife of the town's only doctor. "That woman's near tall as my husband and twice as broad through the shoulders. What manner of Christian family raises a daughter to such unnatural proportions?" Her companion, Eleanor Fitzgerald, whose husband owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, nodded sagely. "Mark my words, Martha, that sort comes to no good. A woman ought to know her place, and that one's place ain't among civilized folks." But Clara paid no mind to the stares and whispers. She'd endured them all her life. From childhood playmates who called her giant girl to suitors who approached her only on dares from their friends. She'd learned early that the world judged harshly what it couldn't understand. And she'd grown strong in ways that went deeper than muscle and bone. Within a week, Clara had rented a small cabin on the edge of town and set up shop as a blacksmith, taking over the forge that had stood empty since old Pete Morrison died the previous spring. The sight of a woman working iron, her powerful arms swinging a hammer with practiced precision, drew crowds of curious onlookers. Some came to gawk, others to test whether she could truly do a man's work. Clara proved herself quickly. She shod horses with skill that surpassed Morrison's best efforts, repaired wagon wheels that other smiths deemed hopeless, and crafted ironwork of such beauty and strength that even her harshest critics grudgingly admitted her talent. Her prices were fair, her work honest, and her word reliable, qualities that mattered more than appearances in a place where winter could kill the unprepared. Still, she remained an outsider. The Ladies' Auxiliary made it clear that membership was reserved for women of appropriate stature and demeanor. The unmarried men of Cedar Flats treated her as a curiosity rather than a potential wife. She attended church each Sunday, sitting alone in the back pew while families clustered together like islands of belonging she could never reach. It was on such a Sunday, as autumn painted the mountainsides in gold and crimson, that Jeremiah Stone made his seasonal journey to town for supplies. He'd traded his furs at Mackenzie's and loaded his packhorse with flour, coffee, salt, and the few luxuries that made mountain winters bearable. As always, he'd planned to complete his business and disappear back into his high country before the curious stares became too burdensome. But as he led his horse down Main Street, something made him pause. Through the open doors of the Methodist church came the sound of hymn singing, voices raised in amazing grace with the kind of fervor that only frontier faith could inspire. And rising above the chorus, clear and strong as mountain air, came a voice that made Jeremiah's heart skip against his ribs. He found himself drawn to the church window, his massive frame casting a shadow across the colored glass that someone had hauled all the way from Denver. Inside, the congregation sang with eyes closed and hearts open, but Jeremiah saw only one figure. In the back pew sat a woman whose height and strength matched his own, whose voice carried such beauty that it seemed to harmonize with something deep in his soul. Clara sensed his presence before she saw him. Some instinct, honed by years of being watched and judged, made her look toward the window where a silhouette blocked the morning light. Their eyes met through the glass, pale blue meeting summer sky, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither the townspeople's gossip nor the wilderness's isolation could explain. After the service ended and the congregation filed out in their Sunday finery, Jeremiah waited by the church steps. Clara emerged last, as was her custom, avoiding the clusters of families that gathered to exchange pleasantries and social observations. She moved with grace despite her size, carrying herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to find strength in solitude. "Ma'am," Jeremiah said, removing his hat to reveal hair as black as his beard. His voice, unused to conversation, came out rougher than he'd intended. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Jeremiah Stone." Clara paused, studying this giant of a man who stood before her without the mixture of fear and fascination she'd grown accustomed to seeing in men's eyes. Instead, she saw recognition, not of her strangeness, but of something familiar, something kindred. "Clara Magnuson," she replied, extending a hand that could match his grip for grip. "I've heard tell of you, Mr. Stone. They say you live up in the high country." "That I do," he confirmed, finding her handshake firm and honest as her gaze. "And I hear you've taken over Morrison's forge. Folks say you do fine work." "I do what's needed," Clara said simply. But something in her voice suggested she appreciated being judged by her craft rather than her appearance. Around them, the Sunday crowd had gone suspiciously quiet, conversations trailing off as the good people of Cedar Flats watched this unprecedented meeting between the town's two most unusual residents. Mayor Weatherby's eyebrows had climbed nearly to his receding hairline. Prudence Weatherby fanned herself with such vigor that her feathers threatened to take flight. Judge Blackwell frowned as if witnessing some violation of natural law, but Jeremiah and Clara seemed oblivious to the attention, caught in a conversation that felt as natural as breathing, despite lasting only minutes. They spoke of practical things: the coming winter, the quality of local iron, the challenges of mountain living, but underneath ran currents of understanding that had nothing to do with words. When Jeremiah finally took his leave, promising to stop by her forge the next time he came to town, the whispers started before his horse had cleared the churchyard. "Did you see that?" gasped Sarah Mackenzie, the storekeeper's wife. "Those two giants talking like regular folks. It ain't natural, I tell you. Ain't natural at all." But Clara paid no mind to the gossip. She'd felt something stir in her chest during those few minutes of conversation, something she'd thought lost forever in the long years of being too tall, too strong, too different for any man's comfort. As she walked home to her lonely cabin, she found herself humming the hymn they'd sung that morning, her voice carrying across the evening air like a promise of things to come. High in his mountain fastness, Jeremiah Stone sat by his cabin fire and listened to the wind sing through the pines. But tonight the wilderness symphony seemed incomplete without the memory of a voice that had touched something in his soul he'd forgotten existed: the hope that even giants might find their place in a world that seemed too small to hold them. The weeks that followed brought Jeremiah to town more frequently than anyone could remember. Where once he'd appeared twice yearly, like some mythical creature emerging from the depths of winter, now he found reasons to make the 3-day journey every few weeks. A broken axe handle that needed replacing, a rifle that required the attention of a skilled smith, salt pork that had spoiled and needed replenishing. Each visit found him at Clara's forge, watching her work the bellows and shape red-hot iron with an artist's precision. They spoke of simple things: the weather, the quality of iron, the challenges of frontier life, but their conversations carried the weight of two souls recognizing themselves in another for the first time. Clara crafted a new axe handle for him, carving the hickory with care and attention that spoke of more than mere craftsmanship. The wood fit his massive hands perfectly, balanced and smooth as silk. When she handed it to him, their fingers touched briefly, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with commerce. "This is fine work," Jeremiah said, testing the weight and balance. "Better than I could have hoped for. It should serve you well in the high country," Clara replied. But her eyes held a question she couldn't quite voice: whether he might find reasons to need less service in those lonely mountains. The people of Cedar Flats watched this courtship with growing amazement and alarm. Two giants finding solace in each other's company challenged their understanding of how the world should work. At Mackenzie's general store, speculation ran as thick as molasses in January. "It ain't right," declared Tobias Fletcher, whose small stature made him particularly vocal about the impropriety of the situation. "Those two getting together, it's like watching mountains court each other. Nothing good can come of it." But despite the whispers and sideways glances, Jeremiah and Clara continued their cautious dance of attraction. He brought her gifts from the mountains: wildflower honey, smooth river stones, eagle feathers that caught the light like captured sunbeams. She crafted him items of practical beauty: a knife with perfect balance, horseshoes that would last through the harshest terrain, a fire poker carved with intricate designs. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the mountains in snow and making travel treacherous. For weeks, Clara saw no sign of Jeremiah, and her heart grew heavy with worry and longing. The townspeople seemed relieved by his absence, as if his disappearance might restore the natural order they felt he'd disrupted. Then came the morning when Clara looked up from her forge to see him standing in the doorway, snow melting from his beard and shoulders, his pale blue eyes holding something new, a resolve that made her breath catch in her throat. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying across the ring of hammer on anvil like a bell tolling. "I have something to ask you." She set down her hammer, wiping her hands on her leather apron, knowing somehow that this moment would change everything. "What is it, Jeremiah?" He stepped into the forge, his massive frame filling the space, and for a moment the only sounds were the hiss of cooling iron and the distant murmur of Main Street life beyond the doors. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who'd spent long winter nights wrestling with his heart. "I've lived alone in those mountains for 20 years, he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to say. "Built my life around solitude, convinced myself it was enough. But these past months, getting to know you, I've come to understand that a man can be lonely even when he's content, and content even when his heart aches for something more." Clara felt her pulse quicken, hope and fear warring in her chest like summer storms. "I know what folks say about us," Jeremiah continued. "I know we don't fit their notion of how things should be. But I also know that when I look at you, I see someone who understands what it means to stand apart from the world, someone strong enough to build a life in the wilderness and gentle enough to make that life worth living." He reached into his coat and withdrew, something wrapped in soft buckskin, a ring carved from a piece of mountain granite, polished smooth as glass and fitted with a band of gold he'd panned from the creek behind his cabin. The craftsmanship was crude but honest, shaped by hands that knew how to coax beauty from raw stone. "Clara Magnuson," he said, dropping to one knee in the dirt floor of her forge, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The proposal hung in the air between them like smoke from the forge fire, carrying with it the promise of love and the certainty of struggle. Clara stared at the ring, at this giant of a man kneeling before her, and felt her heart swell with emotions she'd thought lost forever. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, Jeremiah Stone, I'll marry you." The ring slipped onto her finger, as if it had been made for her alone, the cool stone warming against her skin. Jeremiah rose and took her in his arms, and for a moment the world contained only the two of them, two souls finding harbor in each other's strength. But the world beyond the forge had not stopped turning. Within hours, news of the engagement had spread through Cedar Flats like wildfire in dry grass. The reaction was swift and merciless. Mayor Weatherby called an emergency meeting of the town council, his face flushed with indignation. "Gentlemen, we have a situation that threatens the very fabric of our community. This unseemly alliance between these two, these giants, makes a mockery of proper Christian marriage." Judge Blackwell nodded gravely. "The precedent is dangerous. What's to stop other unnatural unions if we allow this to proceed?" Prudence Weatherby organized the Ladies' Auxiliary into a campaign of moral outrage. Their afternoon tea transformed into a strategy session for preserving community standards. "That woman has bewitched him," she declared, her voice sharp as January wind. "No decent man would choose such a creature unless his mind had been addled by some unnatural influence." The gossip spread like poison through the community. Children were told to stay away from the giant couple, lest they be cursed with similar afflictions. Shopkeepers began treating both Jeremiah and Clara with barely concealed hostility. Even Reverend Thornton, when approached about performing the ceremony, hemmed and hawed about the appropriateness of blessing such a union. But perhaps the cruelest cut came from the younger men of the town, who saw the engagement as an opportunity for sport. They gathered outside the saloon, passing a bottle and placing bets on how long the marriage would last. "I give it 6 months," laughed Billy Morrison, Pete's nephew who'd inherited his uncle's drinking habits, if not his skills. "Soon as winter sets in and they're trapped together in that mountain cabin, they'll drive each other mad." "Hell, Billy," countered Tom Fletcher, Tobias's eldest son, "I don't think they'll make it through the wedding night. Imagine those two giants trying to—" His words dissolved into crude laughter that carried on the evening air, reaching Clara as she walked home from her forge. Each laugh felt like a physical blow, but she held her head high and continued walking. The granite ring on her finger, a tangible reminder that she was no longer alone in facing the world's judgment. In his mountain cabin, Jeremiah sat by the fire and carved a wedding chest from pine he'd cut and seasoned himself. Each stroke of the knife carried his hopes for their future, each careful joint a promise of the home they would build together. But even in the high country, the echoes of the town's laughter seemed to follow him, a reminder that their love would be tested by more than mountain winters and wilderness dangers. The date was set for the first Saturday in December, just 3 weeks away. As the day approached, the betting intensified. The gossip grew sharper, and the pressure mounted for someone, anyone, to put a stop to what many saw as an affront to natural order. But in her forge and in his cabin, Clara and Jeremiah continued their preparations, their love growing stronger in the face of opposition, their resolve hardening like iron in the fire. They would marry, despite the laughter and the betting and the cruel whispers. They would build a life together in the mountains, away from small minds and smaller hearts. What they didn't yet know was that the union would produce something the laughing townspeople could never have imagined, a legacy that would transform ridicule into reverence and make legends of their bloodline. The wedding took place on a bitter December morning when frost painted the church windows like lace, and the breath of the few attendees rose in white clouds above the pews. Reverend Thornton had finally agreed to perform the ceremony, though his discomfort showed in every hesitant word and nervous glance. Only a handful of people came to witness the union. Dr. Caldwell and his wife Martha, who possessed enough Christian charity to overlook their reservations. Old Henrik Larsen, the Norwegian trapper who recognized kinship with fellow outcasts, and young Timothy Mackenzie, the storekeeper's son, whose curiosity outweighed his parents' disapproval. But if the congregation was small, the bride and groom filled the church with their presence. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, let out and lengthened to accommodate her magnificent frame, the ivory silk shimmering in the weak winter light. Jeremiah stood beside her in a black suit he'd ordered special from Denver, his mountain-weathered hands gentle as he slipped the matching granite band onto her finger. When Reverend Thornton pronounced them husband and wife, their kiss was brief but tender, a promise sealed before God and the few witnesses brave enough to attend. Outside, snow began to fall in fat, lazy flakes that settled on their shoulders like nature's blessing. The reception was a simple affair in the church basement: coffee, cake, and quiet conversation while the storm gathered strength beyond the windows. As the newlyweds prepared to leave for their honeymoon journey to Jeremiah's mountain cabin, Dr. Caldwell pulled him aside. "You take care of that woman," the doctor said, his weathered face serious. "She's got more courage than half the men in this town, marrying you knowing what she'll face. The mountains are hard on everyone, but they're especially hard on women who aren't born to them." Jeremiah clasped the older man's hand. "I'll guard her with my life, Doc. That's a promise." The journey to the cabin took 4 days instead of the usual 3, as Jeremiah went slowly to accommodate Clara and the pack horse loaded with her belongings and wedding gifts. They followed deer trails and ridgelines known only to him, climbing steadily into country where the air grew thin and the silence spoke louder than words. Clara marveled at the wilderness unfolding around them, peaks that scraped the belly of heaven, valleys carved by ancient glaciers, forests of pine and aspen that stretched beyond the horizon. This was Jeremiah's domain, a kingdom of stone and sky, where he moved with the confidence of absolute belonging. "It's beautiful," she breathed, as they crested a ridge and saw the valley where his cabin nestled among the trees. "More beautiful than I ever imagined." The cabin itself was larger than she'd expected, built from logs that Jeremiah had cut and fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. Inside, everything spoke of solitary comfort. Handmade furniture built to accommodate his size, shelves lined with books, a massive stone fireplace that could warm the entire structure. But it was clearly a bachelor's domain, lacking the touches that made a house a home. "I know it ain't much," Jeremiah said, suddenly uncertain as he watched Clara examine their new home. "Been living alone so long, I forgot what a woman might need or want." Clara turned to him with a smile that warmed him more than any fire. "It's perfect, Jeremiah. We'll make it ours together." Their first weeks of marriage passed in a haze of discovery and adjustment. Clara learned the rhythms of mountain life, how to read weather in cloud formations, how to preserve meat in the cold air, how to navigate by landmarks that shifted with snow and season. Jeremiah discovered the joy of sharing his wilderness kingdom with someone who appreciated its beauty rather than merely enduring its hardships, but the isolation was profound. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and winter's grip made travel treacherous at best. For Clara, accustomed to the daily interactions of town life, the silence could be overwhelming. There were days when the only sounds were wind in the pines and the distant call of hunting wolves. Jeremiah, sensing her struggle, worked to fill the quiet hours. He taught her to track game, to read the stories written in snow and mud. She learned to ski on wooden boards he carved for her, to ice fish in the frozen creek, to appreciate the subtle differences between various types of silence. In return, Clara brought changes that transformed the cabin from shelter to home. She hung curtains at the windows, planted herbs in pots near the kitchen window, filled the rooms with the scent of fresh bread and the sound of her singing. Her presence softened the hard edges of bachelor life, bringing warmth that had nothing to do with the fire on the hearth. By February, Clara knew she was carrying their first child. The knowledge filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Joy at the promise of new life, terror at the thought of giving birth so far from medical help. When she told Jeremiah, his face lit up like sunrise over the peaks. "A child," he whispered, his large hands covering hers. "Our child," but practical concerns soon tempered their celebration. Dr. Caldwell was 3 days' hard ride away, assuming the weather cooperated. Clara would need help when her time came, and Jeremiah's wilderness skills, formidable as they were, didn't extend to midwifery. "We could go to town," he offered, though the reluctance in his voice was plain. "Stay with someone until the baby comes." Clara shook her head. "This is our home, Jeremiah. Our child should be born here, in the place that will shape them. We'll find a way." Spring arrived late that year, snow lingering in the shaded valleys well into May. As Clara's pregnancy progressed, Jeremiah prepared for the birth with the thoroughness he brought to all mountain challenges. He studied medical texts ordered from Denver, practiced procedures on willing barn cats, and stockpiled supplies against every contingency he could imagine. But it was Clara who proved most resourceful. Drawing on childhood memories of helping her mother tend to neighbor women, she prepared remedies from mountain plants: willow bark for pain, yarrow to stop bleeding, pine needle tea for strength. Her hands, so skilled at shaping iron, proved equally capable at preserving life. The rifle that hung over their mantel had belonged to Jeremiah's father, passed down through 3 generations of stone men who'd carved their lives from wilderness. It was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the family's ability to survive in country that tested everyone who dared call it home. As summer deepened and Clara's time drew near, that rifle took on new significance. The mountains held dangers beyond difficult births. Grizzly bears protecting cubs, mountain lions hunting for easy prey, and the occasional human predator drawn by isolation and opportunity. Jeremiah taught Clara to shoot with the patience he showed for all-important lessons. Despite her pregnancy, she proved a natural marksman, her strong shoulders absorbing the rifle's kick, her steady hands finding targets with increasing accuracy. "Every woman up here needs to know how to protect herself and her family," he explained as she practiced on pine cones at increasing distances. "The mountains don't care about your condition or circumstances. They only respect strength and preparation." By late August, Clara could outshoot most men in Cedar Flats, a skill that would prove more valuable than either of them imagined in the trials to come. Samuel Stone entered the world on a September morning when autumn painted the mountainsides in gold and crimson. His birth cry echoed through the valley like a young eagle's call, strong and wild and free. Clara labored for 14 hours, Jeremiah at her side, and when their son finally arrived, both parents stared in wonder at what they had created. The baby was enormous, 12 pounds of healthy, squalling humanity with his father's pale blue eyes and his mother's determined chin. His hands, already large for an infant, gripped Jeremiah's finger with surprising strength. But it was more than his size that marked Samuel as unusual. Even as a newborn, he seemed more alert than other babies. His gaze tracking movement with an intelligence that made his parents exchange meaningful glances. "He's going to be something special," Clara whispered, exhausted but glowing as she held their son. "I can feel it," Jeremiah nodded, studying the tiny face that held such promise. "Stone men have always been large, but this one, he's going to be larger than us all." When news of Samuel's birth reached Cedar Flats, it sparked a new wave of gossip and speculation. The women of the Ladies' Auxiliary discussed the baby's size in hushed, scandalized tones, as if his very existence violated some natural law. The men in the saloon made crude jokes about giant babies and the circumstances of their conception, but there were others who reacted differently. Dr. Caldwell, when he finally made the journey to check on mother and child, marveled at Samuel's robust health and advanced development. "I've delivered hundreds of babies," he told Clara, "but I've never seen one so alert and responsive at such a young age." Old Henrik Larsen, the Norwegian trapper, visited in late October and spent an hour studying the baby with eyes that had seen much in 7 decades of frontier life. "That child carries the mark of greatness," he declared, his accent thick with conviction. "In the old country, we would say he was born with the blessing of the mountain spirits." As winter settled over the high country, Samuel continued to amaze his parents with his rapid development. He lifted his head weeks before other babies, rolled over at 2 months, and began sitting unsupported by 4 months. His appetite was prodigious, and Clara found herself eating constantly to maintain her milk supply. But it was Samuel's physical strength that truly set him apart. By 6 months, he could grip objects with enough force to bend soft metal. Clara discovered this when she gave him a pewter spoon to teeth on, only to find it twisted into an unrecognizable shape an hour later. "Jeremiah," she called, holding up the mangled spoon. "Look at this." Her husband examined the twisted metal, his face a mixture of pride and concern. "That's not possible," he murmured. "No baby should be able to do this." Yet the evidence was undeniable. As Samuel grew, so did demonstrations of his unusual abilities. He crawled with such force that he left gouges in the wooden floor. When he began pulling himself upright, he left handprints embedded in the logs of their cabin walls. The cradle that Jeremiah had carved with such care for his firstborn became the first in a series that would mark the Stone family's growing legend. Made from mountain pine and fitted with loving precision, it bore the wear marks of a child whose strength already exceeded normal bounds. In years to come, that cradle would be displayed in the cabin as a reminder of where the legend began. Word of Samuel's unusual development spread through the mountain communities like smoke signals. Trappers and traders who visited the stone cabin carried tales of the giant baby back to settlements scattered across the territory. Some stories grew in the telling, accounts of an infant who could lift grown men, who spoke full sentences at 6 months, who communed with wild animals. Most of these tales were exaggerations, but the truth was remarkable enough. Samuel did seem to understand human speech earlier than normal children. He did show an unusual affinity for the mountain wildlife that visited their cabin, and his physical development continued to outpace every milestone that marked normal infant growth. In Cedar Flats, the stories created a mixture of fascination and fear. Some saw Samuel's abilities as a blessing, evidence that God smiled upon the union of two pure hearts. Others whispered of unnatural influences, of what happened when giants bred together in violation of divine intention. Mayor Weatherby called another emergency council meeting, his face grave with concern. "Gentlemen, these reports about the stone baby, if they're true, we may have a situation that requires careful consideration." Judge Blackwell nodded thoughtfully. "Unusual circumstances often call for unusual responses. We must think about the welfare of the entire community, but their discussions remained theoretical. As Samuel was safely distant in his mountain home, growing stronger each day under the loving care of parents who saw his abilities as gifts rather than curses. Spring brought new challenges to the Stone household. Samuel, now crawling with tremendous vigor, required constant supervision to prevent him from inadvertently damaging furniture or, more concerning, hurting himself through the sheer force of his movements. Clara fashioned padding for sharp corners and reinforced everything within the baby's reach. The child's appetite continued to amaze. By his first birthday, Samuel consumed as much food as a grown man, his body burning energy at a rate that matched his accelerated development. Jeremiah found himself hunting more frequently, bringing down larger game to keep up with their growing needs. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Samuel's development was his temperament. Despite his unusual strength and rapid growth, he remained a happy, affectionate child who seemed to intuitively understand the need for gentleness. He never used his strength aggressively, never hurt his parents despite his powerful grip. "It's like he knows," Clara observed one evening as she watched Samuel carefully pet a rabbit that had wandered into their cabin. "He understands that he's different, that he needs to be careful." Jeremiah agreed, marveling at his son's instinctive wisdom. Mountain children grow up fast, but this one, he's growing up with the wisdom of someone much older. As Samuel's first birthday approached, Clara discovered she was pregnant again. The news filled them with joy and anticipation, but also with growing awareness that their family was destined to be anything but ordinary. In the town below, betting had resumed about the Stone family's future. But now the wagers centered not on whether their marriage would survive, but on what manner of children they would produce. Some bet on normalcy, eventually asserting itself. Others wagered that each child would be more remarkable than the last. None of them guessed how right the second group would prove to be, or how their casual betting would transform into something closer to awe as the Stone family legend continued to grow. In the mountain cabin where love had conquered ridicule, a dynasty was taking shape that would redefine what it meant to be human in the untamed American West. The cradle that had held Samuel now awaited his sibling, ready to begin rocking another child whose story would become part of frontier folklore. But first, Samuel himself had more growing to do, more impossible feats to perform, more evidence to provide that some families are touched by forces beyond ordinary. Understanding, Daniel Stone arrived in the world on a stormy March night when thunder rolled through the mountains like the voice of an angry god. His birth was even more dramatic than his older brothers, 16 pounds of baby with lungs that could be heard echoing off the canyon walls. If Samuel had been remarkable, Daniel was extraordinary. Where Samuel had been alert and strong, Daniel was alert, strong, and possessed of an almost supernatural awareness of his surroundings. Even as a newborn, his eyes seemed to track things that weren't there, as if he could see beyond the normal spectrum of human perception. His grip was powerful enough to leave marks on his father's hands, and his cries could wake wildlife a mile away. Clara recovered from the birth with the resilience that had sustained her through frontier life. But even she was amazed by Daniel's rapid development. While Samuel had been advanced for his age, Daniel seemed to operate on an entirely different timeline. He held his head up within days of birth, rolled over at 6 weeks, and was crawling by 3 months with a speed that made supervision nearly impossible. The family Bible, which Jeremiah updated meticulously with each significant event, now bore the record of 2 extraordinary births. Written in his careful script were the measurements and milestones that documented the emergence of something unprecedented in human experience. The Bible itself became an artifact of growing legend, its pages chronicling the birth of giants in an age when such things belonged to ancient myths. By Daniel's first birthday, both boys displayed abilities that defied conventional understanding. Samuel, now 2, could lift objects that should have required multiple grown men. Daniel, still technically an infant, possessed coordination and strength that amazed even his parents. Together, they played games that would have been dangerous for normal children. Wrestling matches that shook the cabin, foot races that left craters in the yard. Word of the Stone Children spread far beyond the immediate mountain communities. Traders and travelers carried tales eastward, and soon letters arrived from newspaper reporters and scientific societies requesting interviews. Jeremiah burned them all, understanding that his family's privacy was worth more than any fame or money outsiders might offer. But privacy became increasingly difficult to maintain. The spring of Daniel's 2nd year brought an influx of visitors to the mountain valley, some genuinely curious, others hoping to profit from association with the growing legend. Most were turned away at the valley's entrance by Jeremiah's intimidating presence and clear unwillingness to discuss his family with strangers. A few persistent souls made it through, however. Professor Edmund Hartley from the University of Colorado arrived in June, claiming scientific interest in unusual human development patterns. He was a thin, nervous man whose spectacles constantly slipped down his nose and whose city clothes marked him as hopelessly out of place in the wilderness. "Mr. Stone," he began, mopping sweat from his brow after the arduous journey, "I represent the academic community's interest in documenting extraordinary human capabilities. Your children could be vital to our understanding of human potential." Jeremiah studied the professor with the same intensity he brought to tracking dangerous game. "My children aren't specimens for your studies, Professor. They're my sons, and they deserve to grow up without being poked and prodded by strangers." Clara, holding Daniel while Samuel played nearby, added her own perspective. "We've heard about your scientific communities, Professor Hartley. Seems to me they're more interested in putting unusual folks on display than in understanding anything meaningful." The professor departed frustrated and empty-handed, but not before he'd observed enough to fuel academic speculation for years to come. His published paper, Anomalous Physical Development in Isolated Populations, would become a cornerstone of early anthropological study, though it carefully avoided naming the Stone family directly. That same summer brought a different kind of visitor, one whose presence would prove far more significant to the family's future. Thomas Whitehorse, a Crow warrior whose grandfather had known the mountains before white settlement, arrived at the cabin on a mission that had nothing to do with scientific curiosity. "I've come to see the children who carry the mountain's blessing," he announced simply, his weathered face serious beneath long grey braids. "My people have stories of such children, born when the spirits choose to bless a bloodline with extraordinary gifts." Unlike the professor, Thomas was invited to stay. Over the course of 3 days, he observed the boys with the keen eye of someone who's Culture had always recognized that some humans were touched by forces beyond ordinary. Understanding, your sons carry ancient strength, he told Jeremiah and Clara on his final evening. In the old days, such children became great leaders, protectors of their people. They were revered, not feared. Samuel, now old enough to understand conversation, listened intently as Thomas shared stories of legendary warriors whose strength had protected entire tribes. Daniel, though younger, seemed equally captivated by the old warriors' tales. What does it mean for them? Clara asked. What kind of life can they expect? Thomas considered the question with the gravity it deserved. That depends on how they're raised and how the world chooses to receive them. Strength without wisdom becomes tyranny. Wisdom without courage becomes cowardice. Your sons will need both in abundance. Before leaving, Thomas performed a simple ceremony, blessing both children with smoke from burning sage and speaking words in his native tongue that seemed to resonate through the mountain air. The boys stood still throughout the ritual, as if understanding its significance despite their young age. They will face challenges, Thomas warned as he prepared to depart. People fear what they don't understand, and understanding requires wisdom that not everyone possesses. But they will also inspire greatness in others if they're given the chance. His words proved prophetic. By autumn, reports of the Stone Children had reached Cedar Flats in forms both accurate and wildly exaggerated. Some claimed the boys could uproot trees, others that they communed with bears and mountain lions. The truth that they were simply exceptionally strong and intelligent children seemed almost mundane compared to the mythology growing around them. The town's attitude began to shift, however grudgingly. Dr. Caldwell, who'd been making regular visits to check on the family's health, reported that both children were not only physically remarkable, but also kind, well-mannered, and obviously loved. His medical opinion carried weight with the more reasonable townspeople. Those boys are healthy as horses and twice as strong, he announced at a town meeting. Called to discuss the Stone situation. More importantly, they're being raised right. Clara and Jeremiah are doing everything proper parents should do. But not everyone was swayed by medical testimony. A faction led by Mayor Weatherby continued to view the Stone family with suspicion and resentment. Their unease deepened when Clara announced her third pregnancy in December, as winter settled over the mountains like a white blanket of silence. The betting resumed with new vigor. Would the third child be even more remarkable than the first two? Some wagered that nature would finally assert normal limits. Others bet that each Stone child would surpass the previous one in extraordinary abilities. In their mountain cabin, Jeremiah and Clara prepared for their third child with the confidence born of experience. The cradle that had rocked Samuel and Daniel awaited its newest occupant, while the family Bible stood ready to record another chapter in the growing Stone legend. But as winter deepened and Clara's pregnancy progressed, strange signs began appearing in the mountain wilderness, tracks of unusual size, disturbances that suggested the presence of something far more dangerous than curious academics or hostile townspeople. The mountains, it seemed, held threats that even the Stone family's growing reputation couldn't discourage. The rifle over their mantle would soon serve purposes beyond hunting game, and the children's extraordinary abilities would face their first real test against forces that viewed their strength not with awe or fear, but with predatory interest. Joshua Stone entered the world during a blizzard that lasted 3 days and buried the mountain valley under 10 feet of snow. His birth cries shattered icicles hanging from the cabin eaves and sent wildlife fleeing for miles in every direction. At 18 pounds, he was the largest of the Stone children yet born, and his strength was immediately apparent when he gripped the doctor's finger with enough force to make the seasoned physician wince. Dr. Caldwell, who had made the treacherous winter journey specifically to attend the birth, stared at the newborn with something approaching disbelief. "Morning, ma'am," called the leader, a scarred man whose eyes held the cold calculation of a predator. "Heard tell you folks got some valuable property up here. Thought we might discuss a business arrangement." Clara straightened from her garden, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle she kept within reach. "We're not interested in any business arrangements. I suggest you move along." The man's companions spread out, a movement Clara recognized as tactical positioning. But before the situation could escalate, Samuel and Daniel approached the strangers with the fearless curiosity of children who had never learned to be afraid. "Who are you?" Samuel asked, his 4-year-old voice clear and strong. At nearly 5 feet tall, he was already larger than some grown men, though his youthful face marked him clearly as a child. The rustlers exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for children of such unusual size. Their leader recovered first, his voice taking on a falsely friendly tone. "Well now, boy, aren't you a big one? Where's your daddy?" "Working," Daniel answered simply, stepping protectively in front of his baby brother Joshua, who sat playing in the dirt nearby. Though only 3, Daniel stood nearly as tall as Samuel and possessed an awareness that made him seem far older than his years. The lead rustler made the mistake of reaching for his gun, perhaps thinking to intimidate the family into submission. He never completed the motion. Samuel, moving with speed that defied his size, crossed the 20 feet between them in 2 strides and grasped the man's wrist with enough force to make bones creak audibly. "You shouldn't point guns at my mama," Samuel said, his young voice carrying an authority that belonged to someone much older. "My daddy says that's not polite." The rustler tried to pull free, his face contorting with pain and shock. His companions moved to help him, but Daniel stepped forward, and something in the younger boy's expression froze them in place. "I think you should leave now," Daniel said quietly. "Before my daddy comes back." As if summoned by his son's words, Jeremiah emerged from the tree line where he'd been checking trap lines. The sight of 3 armed strangers threatening his family transformed him from a peaceful mountain man into something far more dangerous. His rifle appeared in his hands with fluid grace, and his pale blue eyes went cold as winter ice. "You have exactly 30 seconds to get off my land," he said, his voice carrying the quiet menace of an avalanche waiting to fall. "After that, I stopped being neighborly." The rustlers, faced with a giant father and his extraordinary children, decided that discretion was indeed the better part of valor. They departed with as much dignity as they could muster, but word of their encounter spread quickly through the criminal underworld that preyed on isolated settlers. The Stone family, it was learned, was not an easy target. But if the first confrontation established the family's ability to defend themselves, it also marked a turning point in their relationship with the surrounding communities. News of how Samuel and Daniel had handled armed adults reached Cedar Flats and the other settlements, transforming abstract stories about strong children into concrete evidence of their remarkable abilities. Dr. Caldwell, when he heard the account, shook his head in amazement. A 4-year-old boy overpowering a grown man. If I hadn't seen those children myself, I'd call it impossible. The story evolved in the telling, as frontier stories often did. Some versions had Samuel lifting horses, others had Daniel stopping bullets with his bare hands. But beneath the exaggerations lay a truth that even the most skeptical had to acknowledge. The Stone children were unlike anything anyone had ever seen. In Cedar Flats, the betting took on a different character. No longer were people wagering on whether the children were truly extraordinary. That question had been settled. Now they bet on what the boys might accomplish as they grew older, what kind of men they might become, whether their strength would be used for good or ill. Mayor Weatherby, faced with shifting public opinion, found his position increasingly uncomfortable. The townspeople who had once supported his efforts to discourage the Stone family were now asking pointed questions about why he'd opposed them so vigorously. "Seems to me," observed Henrik Larsson, during one heated town meeting, "that family up in the mountains has done nothing but good for this community. They've run off rustlers who've been plaguing our ranches for years. Maybe it's time we stopped treating them like outcasts and started treating them like the asset they clearly are." The old Norwegian's words carried weight with the practical-minded frontier folk who valued results over social conventions. A delegation was formed to visit the Stone family and extend a formal apology for the town's previous treatment. But Jeremiah and Clara, when approached with the offer of reconciliation, received it with cautious grace. They harbored no grudges, but they had learned to be wary of sudden changes in public opinion. "We appreciate the gesture," Jeremiah told the delegation, "but our boys are still young, still learning what it means to carry the strength they've been given. We'll continue to live quietly up here, raising them right, and hope that's enough for everyone." Clara added her own perspective, her voice carrying the wisdom of a mother who understood the challenges her children would face. Strength without character is dangerous, whether it's in a normal man or an extraordinary one. Our boys will learn to use their gifts responsibly, but that learning takes time and patience. As summer arrived and Joshua celebrated his first birthday by lifting objects that should have required multiple adults to move, the Stone family settled into a new phase of their mountain life. They had proven themselves capable of defending their home and family. They had earned a grudging respect from their neighbors, but most importantly, they had begun establishing the moral foundation that would guide their sons as they grew into the legends that frontier folk would tell around campfires for generations to come. The wooden sign at their valley entrance now bore 3 notches, marking 3 extraordinary children born to love that had conquered ridicule. But the story of the Stone family was far from over, and the greatest challenges and the greatest triumphs still lay ahead in the untamed wilderness they called home. "Clara." "Jeremiah," he said slowly, "this child is beyond anything I've seen in 40 years of medical practice. His muscle tone, his reflexes, his awareness, it's as if he was born already months old." Clara, exhausted but radiant, held her newest son with the expertise of a mother who had learned to handle extraordinary children. "Each one has been special in their own way," she said, marveling at Joshua's alert gaze. "But this one, there's something different about him." Indeed, Joshua's development outpaced even his remarkable brothers. While Samuel had been advanced and Daniel extraordinary, Joshua seemed to operate according to entirely different laws of human growth. He lifted his head and tracked movement within hours of birth. By 1 week he was rolling over. By 1 month he was sitting unsupported and reaching for objects with startling precision. The wooden sign that Jeremiah had carved to mark their property line now bore a new significance. "Stone Ranch," it read, burned into seasoned oak and mounted on a post at the valley's entrance. But beneath the family name, Jeremiah had begun adding notches, 1 for each child born, each mark representing another addition to what people were starting to call the Stone Dynasty. The sign served multiple purposes. It marked their territory for legitimate visitors, but it also served as a warning to those who might approach with less honorable intentions. Tales of the Stone family's extraordinary children had spread far beyond the immediate region, attracting attention from elements of society that parents of unusual children had good reason to fear. By spring, when Joshua was 6 months old and already displaying strength that rivaled his 2-year-old brother Daniel, the Stone property had attracted the interest of men whose intentions were far from academic. Cattle rustlers, claim jumpers, and various criminal elements had begun probing the valley's defenses, drawn by reports of isolated wealth and hoping to find easy targets. They could not have been more wrong. The first group, to test the Stone family's resolve, arrived on a misty April morning when the boys were playing in the yard while Clara tended her garden. 3 rough-looking men on horseback approached the cabin with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to taking what they wanted from weaker victims. The wanted poster arrived with the autumn mail, carried by a circuit rider who seemed nervous about more than just the treacherous mountain trails. With shaking hands, he passed the weathered paper to Jeremiah, mumbling something about official business from the territorial marshal's office. The poster bore a familiar face sketched in black ink, the scarred leader of the rustlers who had threatened the family that spring. But it was the text beneath the image that made Jeremiah's blood run cold. Wanted, Marcus Blackjack Whitmore, leader of the Blackwood Gang. $500 reward for information leading to capture. Warning, extremely dangerous. Has sworn vengeance against former Federal Marshal J. Stone for killing his brother during Deadwood bank robbery. 1879, Clara, reading over her husband's shoulder, felt the world shift beneath her feet. "Jeremiah?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "Federal Marshal J. Stone." The secret that Jeremiah had carried for 15 years hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. The boys, playing nearby with Joshua's first wooden toys, seemed to sense the sudden tension in their parents' voices. Samuel, now 5 and perceptive beyond his years, approached with the careful steps of a child who understood that something significant was happening. "Daddy?" Samuel asked, his pale blue eyes, so like his father's, studying the poster with intelligence that belonged to someone much older. "Who is that man?" Jeremiah knelt to his son's level, his massive hands gentle as he placed them on Samuel's shoulders. "That's someone from my past, son. Someone I hoped never to see again, but explanations would have to wait." Clara's sharp eyes had caught movement on the ridgeline above their valley, riders approaching in the systematic pattern that spoke of military or law enforcement training. Too many riders to be friendly visitors, too organized to be casual travelers. "Jeremiah," she said quietly, her hand moving to the rifle that was never far from reach. "We have company." The riders numbered 12, led by a man whose silver badge caught the afternoon sunlight. U.S. Marshal William Harrison rode with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority, but even his experienced eyes widened when he saw the Stone family assembled in their yard, 3 children whose size and bearing marked them as anything but ordinary, flanked by parents who stood like sentinels guarding something precious. "Marshal Stone," Harrison called out, using the title that Jeremiah hadn't heard in 15 years. "Or do you prefer Mr. Stone these days?" The question hung in the air like gunsmoke as the boys looked between their father and the approaching lawman. Daniel, with his uncanny ability to sense emotional undercurrents, moved protectively closer to his mother. Joshua, barely walking but already showing signs of his brother's remarkable awareness, toddled to his father's side. "It's just Mr. Stone now." "Marshal," Jeremiah replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. "Has been for a long time." Marshal Harrison dismounted, his movements careful and respectful. He was clearly a man who understood the delicate nature of his mission. "I'm here about the Blackwood Gang, Jeremiah. They've been hitting banks and stagecoaches from Denver to Salt Lake City, and according to our sources, they're planning something big in this territory." Clara stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her shock at learning about her husband's hidden past. "Marshal, my husband has been living peacefully in these mountains for 15 years. Whatever he was before, he's a family man now." "Ma'am, I understand your concern," Harrison replied, his hat in his hands. "But the gang isn't interested in what your husband has become. They only care about settling an old score. Marcus Whitmore has been telling anyone who'll listen that he's going to make Jeremiah Stone pay for killing his brother." Samuel, who had been listening with the intensity that marked all his attention, spoke up with a clarity that made the marshal blink in surprise. "My daddy killed someone?" The question came from a 5-year-old child, but the voice that asked it belonged to someone who understood that the world contained both good and evil, and that sometimes good men had to do terrible things to protect innocent people. Jeremiah knelt again, gathering all 3 of his sons around him. "Boys, before I met your mother, before I came to these mountains, I was a lawman. It was my job to catch bad men who hurt innocent folks. Sometimes when bad men wouldn't surrender, I had to fight them. And sometimes people died in those fights. Daniel, barely 4 but possessing wisdom beyond his years, reached out to touch his father's weathered face. "Did you hurt innocent people, Daddy?" "No, son. I spent my life protecting innocent people. But that meant I made enemies among the bad men I stopped." Clara, processing the revelation that her husband had been one of the most famous federal marshals in the territory, felt a strange mixture of pride and fear. The man she'd married for his gentleness and strength had once been known as Phantom Stone, the lawman who appeared without warning to bring justice to the lawless frontier. Marshal Harrison, watching the family dynamic with growing respect, cleared his throat. "The Blackwood gang has been asking questions about you, Jeremiah. They know about your family, about these boys. Whitmore isn't just planning revenge. He's planning to hurt what matters most to you, the threat against his children." Transformed Jeremiah from peaceful mountain man back into the federal marshal who had never lost a fight against criminal elements. His pale blue eyes went cold as winter death, and his voice carried the authority that had once made outlaws surrender without drawing their guns. "How many men does Whitmore have?" he asked, and Clara heard in his tone the echo of the man she'd never known, the legendary lawman whose reputation had cleared entire territories of criminal activity. At least 20, probably more. They've been recruiting from every gang between here and California. "This isn't just about revenge anymore, Jeremiah. Whitmore is planning to use your reputation to build himself into the most feared outlaw leader in the West." Samuel, whose remarkable intelligence allowed him to follow the adult conversation despite his young age, looked up at his father with eyes that held no fear, only determination. "Are they going to try to hurt Mama and Joshua and Daniel?" "They're going to try, son," Jeremiah answered honestly. "But they're going to find that the Stone family is harder to hurt than they expect." The badge that Marshal Harrison carried in his saddlebags wasn't just a piece of metal. It was a symbol of the authority and responsibility that Jeremiah had set aside when he chose love over duty 15 years ago. When Harrison offered it to him, along with a temporary commission to deal with the Blackwood gang, Jeremiah stared at it for a long moment. "I swore I was done with that life," he said quietly. "Some oaths are stronger than others," Harrison replied. "Your oath to protect your family might just be the strongest of all." Clara, understanding that their peaceful mountain existence was about to change forever, stepped beside her husband. "If you pin on that badge, you won't be facing this alone. This family has always stood together, as if summoned by their parents' resolve." The three boys moved to stand with them, Samuel tall and serious beyond his years, Daniel alert and ready for whatever might come, Joshua toddling on unsteady legs but clearly determined to be part of whatever was happening. The sight of the Stone family, united in the face of threat, sent a message that even Marshal Harrison's experienced deputies understood. They weren't looking at potential victims. They were looking at a force of nature that the Blackwood gang was about to encounter. When Jeremiah finally pinned the federal marshal's badge to his shirt, it felt both foreign and familiar, like picking up a tool he'd set aside but never forgotten how to use. The boys watched with wide eyes as their father transformed before them from gentle mountain man to something far more formidable. "What happens now, Daddy?" Daniel asked, his young voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. Jeremiah looked out across the valley that had been their sanctuary, then back at his extraordinary family. "Now we show the Blackwood gang what happens when you threaten a Stone family that's learned to stand together." The revelation of Jeremiah's past had changed everything and nothing. He was still the loving father and devoted husband his family knew, but he was also something more, a legendary lawman whose skills and reputation would soon remind the criminal underworld why some men became legends not through violence, but through an unwavering commitment to protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The old badge felt heavier than Jeremiah remembered as he polished its tarnished surface by lamplight. 15 years had passed since he'd last worn the star that marked him as a federal marshal, but the weight of responsibility it carried remained unchanged. Across the cabin, Clara packed supplies with the methodical efficiency of a woman preparing for war, while the boys slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Marshal Harrison had departed at dawn with half his men, carrying word to the territorial capital about the Blackwood gang's planned assault. The remaining deputies had taken positions around the valley, but Jeremiah knew that 6 lawmen, no matter how skilled, wouldn't be enough to stop 20 hardened outlaws bent on revenge. "The townspeople need to know what's coming," Clara said, her voice cutting through the pre-dawn silence. "Cedar Flats deserves a chance to prepare." Jeremiah nodded, studying the tactical map he'd sketched of the valley and surrounding approaches. "I'll ride down tomorrow. Give them a choice. They can evacuate until this is over, or they can stand with us." "You know what they'll choose," Clara said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "They've finally figured out what kind of neighbors they have. They won't abandon us now." She was right. The transformation in Cedar Flat's attitude toward the Stone family had been gradual but complete. Where once the townspeople had viewed them with suspicion and ridicule, they now spoke of the family with pride and protective fondness. The children who had once mocked the giant couple now boasted about knowing the famous Stone boys personally. But admiration and loyalty were different things than combat effectiveness. And Jeremiah harbored no illusions about what they would face when the Blackwood gang arrived. Marcus Whitmore had spent 15 years nurturing his hatred, gathering men who shared his appetite for violence, and planning a revenge that would cement his reputation as the most feared outlaw in the territory. The next morning brought Samuel's excited voice echoing through the cabin. "Daddy, Daddy, come see what Daniel and Joshua are doing." Jeremiah stepped outside to find his 2 younger sons engaged in what appeared to be a training exercise of their own devising. Daniel, at 4 years old, had fashioned wooden swords from pine branches, while 3-year-old Joshua wielded a stick with the same intensity that grown men brought to real weapons. "We're practicing being marshals like you, Daddy," Daniel announced, parrying his baby brother's enthusiastic attacks with skill that belonged to someone much older. "Joshua says the bad men won't expect babies to fight." The sight of his youngest sons preparing for battle with childlike determination filled Jeremiah with pride and heartbreak in equal measure. They were too young to fully understand the danger approaching, but old enough to sense their family's need for unity and preparation. Samuel approached more seriously, carrying a genuine rifle scaled down to fit his remarkable size. "Papa Henrik brought this for me," he said, referring to the old Norwegian trapper who had become an unofficial grandfather to the boys. "He says I'm old enough to help protect the family." Clara emerged from the cabin, her expression mixing maternal concern with frontier pragmatism. "Samuel, you're 5 years old. Fighting grown men isn't—" "I'm bigger than most grown men, Mama," Samuel interrupted gently, his voice carrying the respectful tone that marked his upbringing. "And stronger. Papa Henrik says that makes it my responsibility to help." Looking at her eldest son, 5 years old but standing nearly 6 feet tall and possessing strength that defied natural law, Clara struggled with the conflict between protective instincts and practical necessity. The approaching threat made normal parental concerns seem almost insignificant. Jeremiah knelt beside Samuel, his weathered hands checking the rifle's action with professional competence. "Son, carrying a gun means being ready to take a life to protect the people you love. That's not a decision any man should make lightly, especially one as young as you." "I understand, Daddy," Samuel replied, his pale blue eyes holding wisdom that belonged to someone much older. "But if bad men try to hurt Mama or Daniel or Joshua, I won't let them. I can't let them." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, not the organized pattern of lawmen, but the irregular rhythm of civilians pushing their horses hard. Jeremiah's hand moved instinctively to his gun as riders crested the ridge and descended into the valley. But these weren't outlaws. Dr. Caldwell led a delegation of townspeople from Cedar Flats, their faces grim with determination and purpose. Behind him rode Mayor Weatherby, Judge Blackwell, and a dozen other men that Jeremiah recognized as the backbone of the frontier community. "Marshal Stone," Dr. Caldwell called out, using the title with obvious pride. "We heard about the threat to your family. We've come to help, Mayor Weatherby, whose opposition to the Stone family had once been legendary, dismounted with the awkward dignity of a man eating a large portion of crow. "Marshal, I owe you and your family an apology for my past behavior. But words aren't going to stop the Blackwood gang. We brought something more useful." The something more useful turned out to be a wagon loaded with weapons, ammunition and supplies, everything the townspeople could spare for what they'd come to think of as their war. Judge Blackwell, whose stern demeanor had intimidated courtrooms for decades, approached with legal documents that made the defensive preparations official. "I've issued warrants for the entire Blackwood gang," he announced, his voice carrying judicial authority. "Anyone who aids in their capture or elimination will be acting under color of law." Clara stepped forward, her maternal instincts extending to embrace the men who had come to defend her family. "You don't have to do this. This isn't your fight." Henrik Larsson, who had arrived with the townspeople despite his advanced age, laughed with the humor of someone who had survived 7 decades of frontier life. "Young Clara, any fight that threatens those boys of yours is our fight. Those children are the future of this territory. And we're not about to let outlaws destroy that future." The old Norwegian's words carried weight with the practical-minded frontier folk who had learned to recognize value when they saw it. The Stone children represented something unprecedented, a new kind of human being, adapted to the harsh demands of wilderness life, possessed of strength and wisdom that could shape the territory's destiny. As the volunteers organized themselves into defensive positions, Jeremiah found himself remembering the tactical skills that had made him legendary among lawmen. He positioned sharpshooters on the ridges, established fallback positions in case the cabin's defenses were breached, and created overlapping fields of fire that would make any assault costly for the attackers. But it was Clara who proposed the most innovative defensive strategy. "The boys' abilities aren't just for protection," she pointed out during an evening planning session. "They're advantages that Whitmore won't expect or know how to counter." Samuel, overhearing the adult conversation, offered his own tactical insight with the serious demeanor of someone much older. "Mama's right. Bad men think children are weak. They won't be ready for children who can fight like grown-ups." Daniel, not to be outdone by his older brother, added his own contribution. "And they won't expect us to work together. Joshua might be little, but he's stronger than normal men. If we coordinate our attacks—" "Boys," Jeremiah interrupted gently, "this is adult business. Your job is to stay safe and let the grown-ups handle the fighting." "With respect, Daddy," Samuel replied, his voice carrying the polite firmness that marked his character. "We're not normal children, and this isn't a normal situation. We can help, and we should help." Clara, looking at her extraordinary sons, made the difficult decision that frontier mothers sometimes faced. If they're going to be in danger anyway, they might as well be useful danger. But they stay close to the cabin, and they follow orders without question. The final defensive preparations took place under a star-filled sky that seemed to promise either triumph or tragedy. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, ammunition was distributed, and final messages were written in case the worst happened. The townspeople who had once mocked the giant couple now prepared to die defending them, understanding that some things were worth more than life itself. Dr. Caldwell, making final medical preparations, paused in his work to observe the Stone family gathered around their evening fire. "You know," he said to Henrik Larsson, 15 years ago, those people were the town joke. Now they're what we're willing to fight and die for." "Funny how perspectives change," the old Norwegian nodded sagely. "Not perspectives, Doctor, understanding. We finally understand what we have here, and what we stand to lose if we let evil men destroy it." As the night deepened and sentries took their positions, Jeremiah made one final check of the defenses. The badge on his chest caught starlight as he moved through the shadows, and he felt the weight of responsibility that had defined his younger years. But this time, the stakes were more personal than justice or law. This time, he fought for the family that had transformed him from a lonely lawman into something better. In their cabin, Clara read bedtime stories to boys who would face their first real battle in the morning. Their innocent questions about good men and bad men, about courage and fear, reminded her that no matter how extraordinary their children might be, they were still children who deserved to grow up in a world where strength protected rather than destroyed. The morning would bring violence and testing, but tonight brought the quiet moments that made such fights worthwhile. The sound of children's laughter, the warmth of family love, and the certainty that some things were worth defending with every breath in a person's body. Dawn arrived with the sound of gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. The Blackwood gang struck just as the morning mist began to lift, their attack coordinated with military precision that spoke of Marcus Whitmore's experience with organized violence. 23 outlaws approached the valley from 3 directions, their rifles speaking in deadly harmony as they sought to overwhelm the defenders through sheer firepower. But the defenders were ready. Samuel Stone crouched behind the cabin's reinforced walls, his scaled-down rifle steady in hands that belonged to someone much older. The gun belt that Jeremiah had crafted for him rode his hips with the natural fit of someone born to wear weapons, though his young face remained unmarked by the violence surrounding them. "Remember what we practiced," Clara called to her sons, her own rifle tracking targets with the precision of someone who had learned to shoot for survival rather than sport. "Stay together. Watch your angles and don't take unnecessary risks." The first wave of attackers broke against the defensive positions like water against stone. Hendrik Larsen, positioned on the eastern ridge, proved that age hadn't diminished his marksmanship. His rifle cracked with methodical precision, each shot dropping an outlaw who thought the old Norwegian would be an easy target. Dr. Caldwell, despite his medical oath to do no harm, had armed himself with a shotgun and positioned himself to defend the cabin's rear approach. When 3 outlaws tried to circle behind the main defenses, they found themselves facing a physician whose determination to protect his patients extended to the use of lethal force. But it was the Stone children who provided the day's first major surprise for the attacking gang. Samuel, despite his youth, possessed skills that rivaled veteran gunfighters. His shots found their targets with disturbing accuracy, while his supernatural reflexes allowed him to dodge return fire that should have been impossible for anyone to avoid. Daniel, too young to carry a rifle but old enough to understand tactics, served as his family's eyes and ears. His uncanny ability to sense movement and intention gave the defenders advance warning of flanking attempts and coordinated assaults. Even Joshua, barely 3 years old, but possessed of his family's extraordinary awareness, contributed to the defense by pointing out threats that adult eyes had missed. Mayor Weatherby, crouched behind an overturned wagon that served as defensive cover, shook his head in amazement as he watched the Stone children function as an integrated fighting unit. "Those aren't normal kids," he muttered to Judge Blackwell, who was methodically reloading his rifle between shots. "Nothing about this family is normal," the judge replied, his legal mind appreciating the tactical precision with which the Stones coordinated their defensive efforts. "That's exactly why they're worth defending." The first assault lasted 30 minutes before Whitmore's men pulled back to regroup and reassess their opposition. They had expected to face a handful of townspeople defending an isolated family. Instead, they found themselves confronting organized resistance that had turned their simple revenge mission into a costly siege. Marcus Whitmore himself remained hidden among the rocks above the valley, his scarred face twisted with rage as he watched his carefully planned attack falter against unexpected competence. Through his spyglasses, he studied the defensive positions with the eye of someone who had led men in combat across half the Western Territories. "Boss," called out Jake Morrison, one of his lieutenants, "those ain't normal folks down there. That big kid with the rifle, he's shooting like a man with 20 years' experience. I don't care if he shoots like Wild Bill Hickok," Whitmore snarled. "He's still just a kid, and kids can be killed same as anyone else." But even as he spoke, Whitmore felt the first stirrings of doubt about his carefully planned revenge. The intelligence he'd gathered about the Stone family had focused on Jeremiah's past as a federal marshal and the children's unusual size. Nobody had mentioned that the entire family fought with coordinated precision that belonged to experienced soldiers rather than frontier civilians. The second assault came from the north, where the terrain offered better cover for advancing attackers. This time, Whitmore committed more men and focused their fire on specific defensive positions rather than spreading their attack across the entire perimeter. The strategy might have worked against normal defenders, but the Stone family's extraordinary abilities continued to confound the outlaws' expectations. Samuel moved between firing positions with speed that made him nearly impossible to target effectively. His rifle spoke with deadly authority, each shot carefully placed to maximize both tactical impact and psychological effect on the attackers. Clara, fighting beside her eldest son, felt a mixture of pride and heartbreak as she watched him adapt to combat with skills that seemed almost instinctive. His movements were fluid and confident, his tactical decisions sound, his marksmanship exceptional. But he was still her 5-year-old boy, and the sight of him engaged in mortal combat filled her with emotions too complex for easy analysis. Daniel, serving as the family's tactical coordinator despite his tender age, called out warnings and suggestions with the authority of someone much older. "Samuel, 3 men moving up the creek bed on your left. Mama, they're trying to flank us from the corral." The second assault ended like the first, with the attackers withdrawing. After suffering casualties they couldn't afford while inflicting minimal damage on the defenders. But Whitmore's fury was growing with each failed attack, and experienced outlaws knew that desperate leaders often made decisions that endangered everyone under their command. As the morning wore on and the siege continued, it became clear that the Blackwood gang faced a choice: withdraw and abandon their revenge mission, or commit to an all-out assault that would either destroy the Stone family or result in the gang's complete destruction. The final assault came with the afternoon sun, when shadows grew long and desperation had replaced strategy in Marcus Whitmore's tactical thinking. The outlaw leader had lost 8 men to the morning's fighting, and his remaining followers were beginning to question whether revenge was worth the cost they were paying. But Whitmore's hatred burned too bright for rational thought. 15 years of nursing his grievance against the man who had killed his brother had consumed his ability to retreat gracefully. He would have his revenge against Jeremiah Stone, even if it meant sacrificing every man under his command. "We go in hard and fast," he announced to his remaining followers, his scarred face twisted with fanatic determination. "Kill everyone you see. No prisoners, no mercy, no quarter given or asked." The attack came from all sides simultaneously, a desperate gamble that committed every remaining outlaw to a single, overwhelming push. Gunfire erupted like thunder as 20 ardent criminals charged the defensive positions with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for their lives. But as the smoke and chaos of battle enveloped the valley, the true nature of the Stone family's extraordinary abilities finally revealed itself to their enemies. Samuel Stone moved through the combat zone like a force of nature, his supernatural speed and strength allowing him to engage multiple attackers simultaneously. When his rifle ran empty, he transitioned to the revolver on his hip with fluid grace, his shots finding their targets with precision that belonged to legendary gunfighters rather than 5-year-old children. Daniel, despite his young age, proved equally formidable in his own way. His uncanny ability to predict enemy movements allowed him to coordinate the defenders' responses with tactical genius that confounded the attackers' attempts at organized assault. His young voice cut through the gunfire, directing fire and movement with authority that grown men instinctively obeyed. Even little Joshua, barely old enough to walk steadily, contributed to the family's defense with actions that defied belief. When an outlaw broke through the perimeter and threatened Clara, the 3-year-old moved with impossible speed to interpose himself between his mother and the gunman. The sight of a toddler facing down an armed killer with complete fearlessness unnerved the outlaw enough to spoil his aim, giving Clara the split second she needed to end the threat permanently. Jeremiah, fighting with the skills that had made him legendary among lawmen, found himself watching his children with a mixture of pride and awe. They moved together like parts of a single organism, each compensating for the other's positions, each maximizing their extraordinary abilities in service of family survival. But it was Clara who provided the day's most decisive moment. When Marcus Whitmore himself finally entered the battle, seeking to end his vendetta through personal combat with the man who had killed his brother, he found himself facing not just Jeremiah Stone, but the entire Stone family, fighting as a coordinated unit. "Stone!" Whitmore bellowed, his voice carrying across the battlefield like the cry of a hunting predator. "Face me like a man, you badge-wearing bastard!" Jeremiah stepped into the open, his federal marshal's badge catching the afternoon light like a beacon of lawful authority. "I'm here, Whitmore. End this now, and your remaining men can ride away. No deals," Whitmore snarled, his guns already in his hands. "You killed my brother. Now I kill your family." The confrontation that followed lasted mere seconds, but would be remembered for generations. Whitmore was fast, faster than most men who made their living with guns. His draw was smooth, his aim true, and his hatred gave him the edge of desperation. That often proved decisive in gunfights, but he had never faced the combined fury of a family whose love had been forged in the crucible of frontier, hardship, and tempered by extraordinary abilities that defied natural law. Jeremiah's draw was lightning fast, his federal marshal's training evident in every fluid motion. But even as his gun cleared leather, Samuel moved with supernatural speed to flank Whitmore from the left, while Daniel circled to the right, their tactical coordination perfect despite their youth. Clara, positioned to protect Joshua, added her own marksmanship to the family's concentrated firepower. 4 guns spoke as one, their thunder echoing off the canyon walls like the voice of divine judgment. When the smoke cleared, Marcus Whitmore lay sprawled in the dust, his long quest for revenge ended by the very family he had sought to destroy. His remaining followers, witnessing the fall of their leader and the impossible coordination of the Stone family's defense, threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. The broken spurs that fell from Whitmore's lifeless feet became an immediate symbol of the battle's outcome. Hendrik Larsen, who had fought with distinction despite his advanced age, picked up the ornate silver spurs and handed them to Samuel with ceremonial gravity. "These belong to you, young Marshal," the old Norwegian said, his voice carrying the weight of witnessed history. "You've earned them through courage and skill that would make grown men proud." Samuel accepted the spurs with the serious demeanor that marked all his actions, understanding instinctively that they represented more than mere trophies. They were symbols of justice prevailing over vengeance, of family unity triumphing over individual malice. The aftermath of the battle revealed the true cost of the Blackwood Gang's quest for revenge. 11 outlaws lay dead, including their leader, while the remaining 12 faced the prospect of federal trials and long prison sentences. Not a single defender had been killed, though several bore wounds that Dr. Caldwell treated with the skill of someone accustomed to frontier violence. But perhaps the most significant casualty was the last vestige of doubt about the Stone family's place in their community. The townspeople who had risked their lives to defend the mountain giants now spoke of them with reverence that bordered on awe. "I've never seen anything like it," Mayor Weatherby confided to Judge Blackwell as they helped tend the wounded. "Those children fought like seasoned soldiers, but they never lost their humanity. Even in the heat of battle, they protected rather than destroyed, defended rather than conquered." The judge nodded thoughtfully, his legal mind processing the implications of what they had witnessed. "They're what we all hoped the frontier would produce, people strong enough to survive its challenges, wise enough to use that strength responsibly." As evening fell over the valley, and the last of the prisoners were secured for transport to territorial authorities. The Stone family gathered around their cabin fire for the first time in days, without the threat of violence hanging over them. The boys, despite their extraordinary performance in battle, remained fundamentally children who needed comfort and reassurance after their first real taste of mortal combat. Clara held Joshua, while Samuel and Daniel leaned against their father's massive frame, seeking the security that only family love could provide. The federal marshal's badge that Jeremiah wore seemed somehow different now, not just a symbol of legal authority, but a tangible reminder that some responsibilities transcended individual choice. "What happens now, Daddy?" Samuel asked, his young voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much violence for his tender years. Jeremiah considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "Now we rebuild, son. We help our neighbors heal from what they've endured on our behalf. We honor the trust they've placed in us by continuing to be the kind of people worth defending." Clara added her own wisdom to the family discussion. "And we remember that strength without purpose is meaningless. But strength used to protect what matters most can change the world." The broken spurs that lay beside the fireplace caught the light like fallen stars, their silver surface reflecting the flames that warmed the Stone family in their moment of victory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the legend growing around their name was built on something more substantial than mere physical prowess. But tonight brought the simple pleasure of survival, of family intact, of love proven stronger than hatred. In the mountain cabin where giants had learned to dream, the future stretched ahead like an unmarked trail leading to horizons bright with promise. 5 years had passed since the Battle of Stone Valley, as historians would later call it, and the morning sun revealed changes that transformed both the mountain homestead and the community that had grown around it. Where once a single cabin had stood in wilderness isolation, now a thriving settlement sprawled across the valley floor. With the Stone family home at its heart, like the hub of a great wheel, the monument erected by grateful townspeople stood 20 feet tall at the valley's entrance, carved from the same granite that had formed Clara's wedding ring so many years before. Its inscription, written in letters deep enough to last centuries, told a simple story that had already become frontier legend, in memory of those who stood with the Stone family against the Blackwood Gang, September 1885. Courage, unity, and love conquered hatred and fear. Here giants walked among us, and we were not afraid. Samuel Stone, now 10 years old and standing nearly 7 feet tall, read the inscription aloud to his younger brothers as they made their morning pilgrimage to tend the monument. His voice had deepened into something that belonged to a much older person, but his words carried the same gentle wisdom that had marked him since birth. "Do you understand what it means?" he asked Daniel and Joshua, who flanked him like young lieutenants attending their general. Daniel, now 9 and nearly as tall as his older brother, nodded thoughtfully. "It means they stopped being afraid of us because we showed them who we really are inside." Joshua, 7 years old, but already displaying the family's characteristic size and strength, added his own interpretation with the seriousness that marked all Stone family discussions. "It means we proved that being different doesn't mean being dangerous." Their understanding reflected the careful education they had received, not just from their parents, but from the entire community that had embraced them as living symbols of the frontier's promise. Teachers had come from as far as Denver to establish schools in the valley. Scholars had written dissertations about the unique educational challenges posed by children whose physical and intellectual development operated according to different timelines than normal human growth. But perhaps the most significant change was evident in Cedar Flats itself, which had grown from a struggling frontier town into a thriving community that people traveled hundreds of miles to visit. The Stone family's reputation drew settlers, merchants, and entrepreneurs who understood that extraordinary people created extraordinary opportunities. Dr. Caldwell, now in his 70s, but still serving as the community's physician, often reflected on the transformation he had witnessed. "When I first delivered Samuel," he would tell visitors, "I thought I was attending the birth of a curiosity. I didn't realize I was witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in human development." The medical texts he had written about the stone children were studied in universities across the nation, though he was careful to protect their privacy while documenting their remarkable abilities. Samuel could now lift objects that required steam-powered machinery to move. Daniel possessed reflexes that allowed him to dodge bullets, literally. Joshua, despite his youth, could outrun horses and leap across streams that normal men needed bridges to cross. But more impressive than their physical abilities was the wisdom with which they used them. Under their parents' guidance, the boys had grown into young men whose strength served others rather than dominating them. They helped build homes for new settlers, rescued travelers trapped by mountain storms, and protected their community from the various dangers that frontier life presented. Clara, now in her 40s, but still possessing the strength and beauty that had first caught Jeremiah's attention, had become the valley's unofficial leader in matters of community development and social organization. Her blacksmith shop had evolved into an industrial center that supplied tools and equipment throughout the territory. But more importantly, she had become the wise woman to whom families brought their problems and concerns. "Strength is a gift," she would tell parents struggling to raise children in the harsh frontier environment. "But wisdom is a choice. We can teach our children to be strong, but they must choose for themselves whether to be wise." Jeremiah, his hair now more silver than black, but his frame still magnificent, had traded his federal marshal's badge for the unofficial title of Territorial Peace Officer. He traveled throughout the region, settling disputes and maintaining order with the quiet authority that had always marked his character. But his greatest pride remained his family and the community they had built together. The evening gatherings around the Stone family fire had become legendary throughout the territory. Visitors came from across the West to hear the stories, share the wisdom, and witness the proof that different didn't mean lesser. Children from normal families played alongside the Stone boys, learning that strength could be gentle, that power could be protective, that legends could be kind, as autumn painted the mountains in their annual display of gold and crimson. The Stone family gathered for their traditional harvest celebration. 3 more children had joined the family over the years. Rebecca, now 4, and showing early signs of her brother's remarkable abilities. Thomas, 2 years old and already walking with the confident stride that marked Stone children. And baby Elizabeth, whose birth had been attended by delegations from 3 territories seeking to witness another addition to the legendary bloodline. The celebration drew hundreds of visitors, transforming the valley into a temporary city of tents and wagons. But at its heart remained the simple truth that had always defined the Stone family. Love conquered fear. Understanding defeated prejudice, and strength used wisely could change the world. Samuel, now approaching his 11th birthday and showing signs of the leadership qualities that would one day make him territorial governor, stood before the assembled crowd with the natural authority that belonged to those born to command. "When my parents first walked through Cedar Flats," he said, his young voice carrying clearly across the gathering, people laughed because they looked different. They didn't understand that difference can be strength, that unusual can be wonderful, that love creates its own kind of magic. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of lived experience and witnessed transformation. In the audience, former skeptics nodded agreement, while their children played fearlessly with the Stone youngsters, understanding instinctively what their parents had needed years to learn. As the celebration continued into the night and the monument gleamed under starlight, Clara and Jeremiah stood together, watching their children interact with the community that had become their extended family. The laughter that had once mocked them had been transformed into celebration. The fear that had once driven them away had become the love that drew people from across the continent. Sometimes, Clara said softly, her hand finding Jeremiah's with the natural ease of long partnership. The greatest victories aren't won through fighting. Sometimes, he agreed, they're won through living well enough that others want to live the same way. The stone family monument would stand for generations, marking not just a battle won, but a transformation achieved. In the mountain valley where giants had learned to love, legend had become reality. And reality had proven more wonderful than any myth. And in the gentle laughter of children playing without fear of difference, the true victory echoed on, a promise that the future would be built not by those who conquered others, but by those who conquered themselves.